thinking about designing corporate communications, our course this semester, we also have to give consideration to how the interfaces with organizations, whether it's websites, getting in and out of the building, using the product itself, all of those aspects of the interfaces with the company and its product, how do these communicate effectively to users and give users a positive experience? Because that's going to have a critical impact on the level of customer satisfaction and degree of engagement and commitment to the brand. So if we think about our own experiences with navigating our interaction, say, for example, with Waseda University, we'll see that sometimes the interfaces just don't work as they want to, as well as they could, right? We have a lot of decent functionality built into our websites, for example, but there are some pain points, and designers, people work in a design thinking framework, for example, very often strongly emphasize that if we just simply observe people carefully, we can recognize the pain points and we can help to ameliorate them and give people a more positive experience. So without further ado, let's turn to the set of slides that I've got here, and we'll have a look at some of those issues of interface design. The most influential author on interface design, in fact, arguably the originator of the whole concept, is Donald Norman, and one of his most famous books is The Design of Everyday Things. And he's also been a very influential speaker in terms of encouraging people to think about the affordances of things, of how people actually interact with interfaces. And so he has specified very clearly a set of, in a sense, criteria or attributes for good design interfaces. So the first thing he emphasizes is visibility. A product naturally communicates how to use it. And he says also that there should be a very clear conceptual model. The effectively users can form effective mental models of the processes that a product entails. Okay, through simply interacting with it, they get a mental model of the structure of, for example, the menus in a digital device. Also, it gives feedback. It can be haptic feedback. So, for example, if you click on your touchpad, that you feel that clicking effect, that's completely faked, actually, digitally. That's artificial, but it's actually giving you feedback. If you turn it off, you'll suddenly notice that actually you touch, and then there seems to be absolutely no reaction. We are, of course, evolved in a way to expect that the physical world will push back with relative degrees of hardness or softness, of course, that we navigate the world, and we do so in a tactile kind of way. And so when we don't get any feedback, it can be quite disorienting. By the way, this extends even to the sense of smell. One of the really scary things about COVID-19, for example, is many people report a loss of a sense of smell. And this actually becomes remarkably disorienting for people, just simply because when they see things visually, they see the sea, or they see something cooking, or something they're very familiar with that has a very distinctive aroma, a scent, and it's not there. And the brain doesn't quite know how to cope with that. And it's in a similar kind of way that if we're trying to have a conversation with someone and we find that we are speaking at them, not with them, that there is absolutely zero reaction, the frustration that can build there is often far worse than if someone was actively disagreeing with you. To just simply get no reaction whatsoever, to have no feedback, is quite an alien process and experience. Now, Don Norman emphasizes, and simply, as he wrote here, and I'll quote him directly, when simple things need pictures, labels, or instructions, the design has failed. By the way, I see that there are still signs up through Building 11 that I remember were hastily printed out and stuck up in April 2009 when we moved across into this building. And this looking rather frayed around the edges. And I remember on the very first day we came over here with a former colleague, is now an architecture professor somewhere else, an architect, made the observation that so many buildings invariably happens all the design failures quickly become clear when people don't know how to navigate the spaces and the signs come up, the ropes get stretched out, people are told to sit or not sit or to go in one direction rather than another direction. Whereas in fact, a well-designed space, like a well-designed product, should be self-explaining. So we should think about visibility fundamentally. Okay, how does an object, how does an interface, so whether a virtual object or something analog, a real physical thing that we're dealing with in our hands, okay, how does it actually communicate to us the way it works? And so you can see that it's very meaningful to think about this in terms of communication design, because objects themselves communicate to their users. And there are some real hints in thinking about interface design for our broader design of communications. Well, Don Norman spoke a lot about affordances. So the perceived and actual properties of an object, what functions, purposes does it afford? What does it permit us to do with the thing? What is this thing for? What will allow us to do with it? How can we put it to a certain use? And well-designed products, well-designed objects, tools are relatively self-explanatory. You know, a hammer is pretty obviously for whacking something with, okay? A knife is unmistakably designed for cutting something, or sometimes more disconcertingly designed optimally for stabbing something or somebody with, okay? But they are relatively self-explanatory. You pick up the object and it not only informs you of what it is for, but it seems to almost urge you to do it in the first place. There is nothing quite like, you know, a well-made tool where a hammer, you really do want to whack something with it. You know, a knife, you really want to start cutting something with it, okay? You immediately anticipate the sense of enablement, you know, that the product is bestowing on you. It is speaking to you of its affordances, of what it will permit you or enable you to do that you couldn't without it. And he says in terms of navigating certain spaces, this is very important that we don't get too fancy, okay? That key functions and how objects enable those functions should be immediately recognizable. Otherwise, we will be disoriented. So, for example, knobs are for turning. By the way, doorknobs are pretty much kind of done away with, okay? We no longer kind of turn things for various reasons. They're normally handles that are up and down, and it's partly to do with being able to get out of buildings in an emergency and whatnot. But we know a doorknob obviously was for turning. Slots are for inserting things into, he says. Okay, so a critical part of this is to overcome the kind of things we talk about with the openness of a text, as discussed in other contexts, that the openness of an image, for example, or the openness of a text that some academics and writers have explored. It's not a very desirable attribute when you've got an interface that you need to be able to navigate sometimes in very challenging circumstances. Driving down the highway in a car, for example, you don't want a lot of ambiguity about what the various controls on the dashboard, what functions are associated with them. So constraints, limiting the number of possible readings or applications of messages, instructions, controls, or patterns are crucially important. If you think about an IKEA catalogue, for example, generally the art is terrible, but what they do try and do is in a combination of design features of the product and those kind of clumsy IKEA drawings have an important functional purpose. They do try and make it unlikely that you will put something together with one part the wrong way, upside down, okay? So effectively, to make it only possible to put it together in the right way. Now, they don't always uphold that, but for the most part, if you're paying attention, the product generally goes together in the right way because it's been designed to require effort to put it together in the wrong way, and with that purely visual, there is no language because they look to sell to so many markets. What they're trying to do is to give you hints as to the only way that it should be done. And then, of course, there is this question of mappings, okay? The relationship between the controls and how a control particularly moves and the results that happen in the world at large, okay? You know, turning a steering wheel obviously changes the car's direction. Now, you could really do someone's head in, of course, if you changed the actual direction they went compared to where you turned, okay? That would be utterly weird. In the interesting video on the Designing Corporate Communications website and Design Thinking, the 60 Minutes documentary that looked at David Kelly and founding IDEO, he discussed the development of the mouse for Apple. And he made the interesting point that initially they tried to figure out that you would move the mouse a certain amount, and then the same distance it would move on the screen. Of course, for us now, that's kind of unthinkable because you're using completely different sized devices, whether you're on a 27 or a 24-inch display or whatever. But he immediately realized that actually your brain is pretty good at working those things out. That the really important thing is the direction of action, that you can match with your hand moving the mouse in a certain direction, and it reads effectively the results that will be happening in the world or the virtual world. So there is ultimately a notion of a conceptual model here, and let's hear what Norman says on this. A good conceptual model allows us to predict the effects of our actions. Without a good model to operate by rote, blindly, we do operations as we are told to do them. We can't fully appreciate why, what effects to expect, or what to do if things go wrong. As long as things work properly, we can manage. When things go wrong, however, or when we come upon a novel situation, then we need a deeper understanding, a good model. Think about driving, for example, where you have no idea where you're going and you're completely relying on the navigation system and listening carefully to it. It will very often get us there. But it is quite an anxious thing, isn't it? You fear that if you make a mistake, you'll have no idea where you are. And particularly for people who, like myself, are older, who did a lot of driving before we ever had navigation systems, it's actually quite intimidating to feel yourself completely dependent upon this bit of technology, that you want to have a little bit of a sense of mental model of where you're going. Now, the Navi may be significantly enabling in telling you to get over into the left lane and for the next road coming up here and turn on the left, but you want some vague sense or some general sense of the lay of the land of where you're going. I think a lot of people, the first thing they do is with the navigation system, they dial in, but then they zoom out the map and they try and get a sense of where they are in relation to the world, then zoom it in and leave it to the navigation. So there's this sense of a mental model. We do this all the time. You know, we tell ourselves stories about how the world works. Now, very often those stories are actually not particularly accurate, and they can really get us in trouble, particularly if we're not inclined to be updating our stories. By the way, one of my key messages to everyone is always be updating. Always be updating your stories, because what we know, interestingly, so much research has shown this, is that once people fix on a certain story, when evidence comes to the contrary, they're slow to update this story. They ignore it, or through inattention they tend to ignore it, until they can no longer ignore it, and then they dramatically revise their story. And we see this, by the way, even in the statistics from financial markets, that asset prices change only slightly, and then bang, they change dramatically in response to a kind of accumulated recognition that the story that people were telling themselves is now out of date. So people tend to be too slow to update this story. But why is that? It's quite understandable. It's a natural human tendency, because we are sense-making machines, as it were. But we have the hardware and the software, and the software are the kind of the stories we tell ourselves to make sense of the world, and we can't be constantly revisiting and stories in light of new information because we're super busy, we're often inattentive, and whatnot. And so devices, tools have been huge enablers for us. Lord Alfred Whitehead, a very famous British philosopher in the early 20th century, said effectively that human civilization advances by increasing the number of things we can do without thinking about them, that we can do things on kind of autopilot. When suddenly the system breaks, then we can be very much kind of caught out because we're really not armed with the story. We have been doing these things on autopilot, or empowered by our devices. So we capture a lot of benefits from this. Where I think we have to be always updating is on the internal devices we have, our own stories that help us to kind of navigate the world and make decisions quickly. When we feel in Japanese, iwakan, the kind of the gap between how we tell ourselves an organization or a market or a process or whatever, or another person and the dynamic with them, how that should be working and but how what we're experiencing jars with that, we should be alert to updating our stories. So we always have to have a model. We have to have stories to ourselves, but they have to be a good model, okay? We want to be updating them. So designers of products, designers of any kind of interfaces, whether it's a virtual interface through software, for example, or a hardware interface with a particular device, a machine, a tool, or whatever, okay, an architectural space, the railway station that we have to navigate through, okay, by actually thinking effectively how people are going to navigate through here and how that environment or that interface actually sends messages back to us will give us a reasonable model of how the world works. Very simple example of this is if those of you know Shibuya and know around the Shibuya station and major landmarks around Shibuya station, and then of course the very complex array of subway system and subterranean paths there, they've been made more navigatable by nice infographics that show major landmarks, 109 for example, Hachiko and whatnot, depicted visually at various points underground, so that you in a sense can take your mental map, your mental model of what Shibuya looks like above ground and where you find yourself underground, and join those two maps up together. Very often we don't. Of course, what we know is a lot of people, when they get disoriented, and I'm one of them, underground, if I go to Marunouchi, for example, the first thing I do is head for the exits. I go above ground, okay? I don't like being like a mole, through the tunnels underneath. I have a very good sense of how Marunouchi kind of fits together above ground. I like being out under the sky and all the rest of it growing up in Australia. So the first thing I do is I head above ground, and then I can get my bearings. While I'm underground, I find it really quite disorienting. But that is a bit of a metaphor for how so many organizations leave us in a somewhat disoriented state. Okay, so to kind of reiterate what I touched on a bit earlier is that we have so much more information constantly bombarding us than we can process us. So the human mind actually is constantly making shortcuts. We have rubrics that really save us the trouble of analyzing constantly our environment. And a simple thought on this, just navigating a very complex spatial environment without running into people, crowded railway station, we're really, really good at it. If someone puts you on the spot and asks you to do a quick mathematical calculation or something, and for a lot of people it'll bring a headache on. So we are extraordinarily good at processing information, complex information, particularly spatial information, but that's because we have so much experience of navigating the world already. We are intuitively extraordinarily good at kind of reading the body language of people who are oncoming towards us, for example, and intuiting if that, they're a kete zombie walking at their phone, and we know that they're not interacting, and therefore they might run into us, and so we have to kind of navigate around them. So we can make sense of a lot of that, because ever since we can, crawl, run, and whatever, we have been navigating the world. So we've become very efficient at doing this. We can get caught out at times, and this sometimes is very deliberately the case when people want to mess with us, to take advantage of our mental shortcuts. Okay. So one of the implications here, of course, is when we're thinking about design, a lot of information can be sourced from the environment. And when a product is well designed from the interface with it, as we use it, we're really learning about it. And so effectively well-designed interfaces reinforce in us the ability to process a lot of information very quickly and be very, very much at ease with it. So all of these spaces, these interfaces, workplaces, everything, all have kind of self-reminding properties, okay? Sometimes when these operations are not so clear cut, we can tell simple stories to ourselves or mnemonics. Anyone who's into kind of memory Olympics or memory competitions, how quickly can you remember a number of cards or images, for example, shown to you? One of the interesting things is a key mental trick. Apparently, I don't do it myself, I should, but apparently, is to assign associations, little stories, and then to assign those stories to imagined space through which you can navigate. Do some Googling on it, okay, rather than me explaining it in a drawn-out kind of way, but really making the most of our spatial complexity. Another critical thing with designing interfaces is to recognize that human beings naturally make mistakes. The old expression to err is to be human, okay? Interface design must accommodate and minimize the consequences of operator error. And as David Kelly at IDEO emphasizes, if you want to make a better interface, all you have to do is just watch people using a poorly designed one. They will grimace, it will be immediately obvious. So poorly designed interfaces are normally very lazy, okay, in their initial development. They've been done as a one-shot kind of thing. Someone's decided how to do it, and they've done it. It hasn't been tested. So IDEO and other people practicing design thinking always emphasize prototyping. Put prototypes in the hands of users, and always try and overcome the fallacy of assumed knowledge, that people will simply know what you know when you made the thing in the first place. There's nothing more exasperating than going into some kind of office and being treated like a complete fool because you don't understand some technical aspect of the administrative process. And why would you? Because who cares? Okay. Yet people who live and breathe inside a bureaucracy take a great delight in their mastering of the logics of it, and come to this fallacy of assumed knowledge that other people know what they do. So when we talk about good interface design, okay, well, it should be intuitive, okay, it should be simply and accurately labeled. There should be a real logic to things with pull-down menus, for example, that birds of a feather flock together, that things that mentally you associate with each other, that seem to belong to the same category of actions, for example, should be clustered together. When I was a little kid, I grew up with Sesame Street, and it was this old song about three of these things belong together. One of them's not the same, and you had to pick out the thing that didn't belong together. We are very good at categorizing. Unfortunately, for example, the computer programmer probably is working with different categories. So maybe with programming tactics or whatever, they've got their own categories, which may be very different from the user-oriented categories. So we need to understand what mental models users bring. What do they see as related to each other? How are they going to be using this device in the first place? Don't make assumptions that we understand how other people will interact with it, because we may have completely different purposes, and we already start with so much more information if we're designing a system or designing a product than users will have. Of course, when things go wrong, the error messages should be informative, and that's one of the things. It's a meme out there. How many times have you had a problem with software and it gives you a 404 or whatever error message, and well, what is that? And then you have to kind of Google what the error message means, or even worse, you get an error message when you can't connect to the internet. So you can't even Google what the error message is unless you've got another device. Okay. But the more fundamental thing is just error-proof the application. Okay. Anticipate the mistakes and minimize the costs of such errors. Okay. Apple's extraordinarily good at this. It says, do you really want to do this? Do you really want to delete this? This cannot be undone. Are you really sure this cannot be undone? Okay. And at the same time, you don't want to be arrogant about it in designing an interface. There wants modesty towards users. You may be working in an organization and hopefully not 50, 40, 35 hours a week. You're thinking about doing a certain set of things, if you're working in a sales office, for example. And this stuff kind of backwards, hopefully. Okay. Students, on the other hand, have got so many things going on in their lives, and just some aspects of course registration, whatever, it's just one small part of all of the things you've got on your mind. Okay, so when we're designing interfaces, we have to bring a modesty towards the users. Okay, at the same time, designers tend to be very aesthetically driven. And one of the problems here is that sometimes art will triumph over usability, particularly with the love of minimalism, trying to make things as starkly simple and beautiful as possible. Okay, but the truth is actually more buttons, each with a dedicated and clear function, makes for a far more usable product. I'm sure many of you have this experience of the wonderful minimalist product, whether it's an alarm clock or whatever, and then you suddenly realize that, as for example, I'm just glancing over here, it's on my table, my nice little compact pocket Osmo little 4K stabilized video camera. To keep it super simple, it's only got two buttons. One of them's record and one's everything else. You turn it on with the everything else button, and then depending on what you want it to do, you press the button once, twice, 3 times, or 4 times. Okay, and you've got to get the pace of it quite right. Because if you pause in between, it's a two stop, and then you've got to kind of go again. Okay, and I don't know how many times I've used it, but I'm still trying to remember which function is three stops and 3 presses, and which one is 4 presses, for example. In the interest of getting it smaller, I understand why they went down to one button. Okay, one bus. But the trade-offs are really quite significant. I'm sure Apple, with its love of minimalism, they have a lot of very intense debates inside Apple themselves about have they gone too far with the simplification. I think sometimes they do. Now, sometimes there is just no regard for the user experience. I'm sorry to finish up with this particular presentation with a bathroom reference. I'm generally deeply averse to any kind of bathroom reference, but many of you may have experienced these infuriating things, especially overseas, where they can rather lazily load up the paper in the bathroom, and fearing that people will steal it, they stack in multiple rolls, and so the cleaners don't have to come by too much. By the way, as soon as you see that, you're thinking, hang on, the cleaners aren't coming here very often. I'm not sure I even want to use this. The signaling implications are actually kind of grim on that. But then, of course, the fundamental problem with this design is the sheer weight of all the rolls on top means that it doesn't come out, does it? Okay. And so then to actually get some paper out, you find yourself having to put your finger in that little slot and lift the rolls up, and it's extraordinarily bad as a user experience. And that's just a start, isn't it? We could talk and talk and talk about the tendency of any hierarchical organization where they think you don't have any choice and you just have to cooperate, take it or leave it. You got to take it because, well, it's obligatory, isn't it? The tax office, or what happens in so many contexts, regulation, you find that they really don't care very much about poor interfaces because they don't think you've got any alternative. So we do tend to see that good interfaces come about primarily when there is competition, when people will walk away. So this tends to lead companies, more responsive companies, to think we've got to do something about this. When it happens in a social services context, normally it's because you've got very engaged constituencies who are really demanding a high level of public services, for example. And sometimes you've got quite inspired states who recognize that technology can be a very significant enabler, for example, and very open to collaborating with designs. For the most part though, bureaucracy is the enemy of good design, user interfaces. So it's no surprise that so many of the hints and the innovations we can see in terms of better interfaces, whether they're virtual interfaces or physical interfaces, tend to come from the private sector, and then belatedly the state catches up.